Hey everybody! So I read the article on reducing implicit prejudice, and I thought that it might be a little bit easier, and also I didn't really know what seminar style presentation meant, so I thought it might be helpful if I gave a little bit of a presentation to you all verbally, and then I also included my notes typed up for you. So I'll do both, I'll post both for you, but I thought I would give you a little bit of a basic rundown about what the article was about. So this was a research article, a more traditional style research article, talking about three basic mechanisms that can be used to reduce implicit prejudice. So the authors of the article define implicit prejudice as social preferences that exist outside of conscious awareness or conscious control, not based on actual experience. They basically suggested that sometimes reducing implicit bias is the only option available. So, for example, if you're trying to choose between two job candidates, it's not always a possibility to make that a blind situation. So, the best way to control for bias is to work on reducing that implicit bias. It's unclear based on research whether or not behavioral changes always follow the reduction of implicit bias, but they did find three basic mechanisms, like I said before, to influence a decrease in prejudice. So the first one that they talked about was associative change, or retraining your associations. So evaluative conditioning is providing experience that forms different associations between concepts and attributes. So concepts like race, so white or black, and then attributes like good or bad. An example of this would be pairing positive images and words with something that the viewer saw as negative before. So, for example, pairing positive words and images with black faces, and then pairing negative words or images with white faces in sort of a controlled laboratory setting. And the findings of this type of study was that racial prejudice reduced immediately, implicit prejudice reduced immediately, and when they retested the subjects 2 days later, it still held up. So that's evaluative conditioning. The second example of associative change is intergroup contact, so basically spending quality time or any type of time with people from other types of groups. So an example of this would be white college students and black college students being intentionally paired up together as roommates. This is the most well-studied means of reducing explicit prejudice, but not a lot of work has been done on whether or not it reduces implicit prejudice. Something that I thought was interesting was that for it to be effective at reducing explicit prejudice, the quality of time matters. So, for example, being roommates or becoming good friends with somebody. So if somebody already has that type of explicit prejudice against a group, they're not really going to be able to let go of that just because they've spent time, unless it's good quality time. However, these researchers found that to reduce implicit bias, the only thing that mattered was quantity of time spent. So that was intergroup contact. And then the third within this associative change category is persuasion. So basically just talking somebody into it. It's been studied extensively for explicit prejudice, again, but not as much with implicit. And basically what the findings of this was that high-level cognition type conversations, so a lot of deep dive, deep thinking type conversations, increased your ability to decrease your prejudice based on cognitive elaboration. So new concepts and new ideas were not as effective, but those more in-depth conversations tended to yield better results. So that was the first basic mechanism, which is associative change. The second is contextual change, so shifting your context. So the first example that they gave was activating counter-stereotypical associations. So elaborating on the opposite of stereotypical associations. So that would be positive examples of disliked groups, negative examples of liked groups. So an example of this in a research setting would be exposing participants to well-known, admirable Black individuals, and then negative examples of white individuals. And just simply showing that type of imagery, so showing, images of Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela, and then, paired with, Hitler, for example, that immediately reduced implicit prejudice. They talked about how other contextual examples matter too. So another example that they gave in a research setting was showing images of Black men in prison. There was a definite difference in later implicit bias testing if the Black man was shown as the lawyer versus as the prisoner, which makes total sense. So another part of contextual change would be affect. So how emotional states interact with prejudice. There honestly wasn't a ton of research. Sorry, Twiggy. Psst. There wasn't a ton of research to suggest that your mood affects implicit bias all that much. Interestingly, it said that people in bad moods tend to show reduced activation of implicit prejudice, but that good moods can sometimes lead to decreased implicit prejudice because it encourages pursuit of acceptable goals. Generally speaking, the evidence on this isn't very good, and there's no evidence to support that any mood or affect effectively reduces implicit bias. The third methodology would be a change in control over implicit prejudice, which is goals, motivations, and behavioral strategies. So the first concept here would be goals for equality. I think they call it egalitarian goals. So basically, if you are an individual who's motivated to pursue equality and who doesn't want to live into any sort of implicit prejudices that you may or may not have, you can actually shut those down just by focusing on your goals for equity. Especially if those goals are intrinsic in nature and ongoing throughout your life, you actually have the ability to decrease your implicit prejudice just by focusing on those goals. And then there are also interpersonal motives, so sort of changing what you're expressing based on where you are and who's in the room and who you're interacting with. So an example that they gave of this was individuals who were in a research group facilitated by a Black person were less likely to express implicit prejudices than those with a white facilitator. So literally just who's in the room and who you're interacting with and how can have an impact, sort of on a case-to-case basis. They also suggested behavioral plans can be helpful, so creating a plan literally to block expression of implicit prejudice. So an example of this would be giving yourself instructions prior to the test, right? So when I see a black face, I'm going to think good. When I'm planning that out ahead of time, they said actually can be an effective strategy in terms of decreasing that implicit prejudice. They also talked about faking it. Basically, you can ignore a task just like you can in any sort of research setting. So that could account for some of those as well. So basically, those are the three different methodologies that they discuss. And it's interesting because basically what they found is that there is evidence to support change, right? You can change your level of implicit bias, but there's not a lot of clarity about what is responsible for that change or moving forward, whether it's true change or just malleability of the brain, right? Like, are we actually changing attitudes when we utilize these mechanisms, or are we just sort of adapting the brain temporarily? There is some evidence to support long-term change. And like I said before, we're not entirely sure whether reducing implicit bias actually leads to a decrease in discrimination. So those are the questions moving forward. Like, how can we use these mechanisms to actually decrease discrimination? How can we use these mechanisms to support the development of long-term implicit bias reduction.